good morning and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. New U.S. envoy to Russia leaves foreign ministry after presenting credentials, meets with senior Russian diplomat in Moscow. The Kremlin says former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson lied about missile threat. Plus, Croatian President Zoran Milanovic slams the West for supplying arms to Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. The United States has sent a batch of 60 Bradley fighting vehicles to Ukraine. That's according to the Transport Command, Transcom, of the U.S. Armed Forces. The command said in a statement, the shipment containing more than 60 Bradleys left the shores of North Charleston, South Carolina last week and will provide the Ukrainian forces with additional offensive and defensive capabilities. At the same time, it's indicated that the U.S. Transportation Command is delivering the first shipment of Bradley fighting vehicles to Ukraine as part of a $2.85 billion military aid agreement announced earlier in January. Statement added that the total amount of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine since February 2022 has amounted to $27.1 billion. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden says the United States will not be providing F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Ukraine's defense minister last week said he will now push for Western fourth-generation fighter planes, such as the U.S. F-16, after securing supplies of battle tanks. Ukraine won a huge boost for its troops last week when Germany and the United States announced plans to provide heavy tanks, ending weeks of diplomatic deadlock on the issue.
Mr. President, will the United States provide F-16s to Ukraine? No. Mr. President,
are you considering a trip to Poland next month? I'm going to go to Poland. I don't know when.
Have you decided
to go to Ukraine? You want to go to Ukraine?
Senator Merrick Garland should appoint a special counsel for Mike Pence?
U.S. President Joe Biden, meanwhile, British Defense Minister Ben Wallace says tanks donated by Britain to Ukraine will be on the front line before summer, without giving an exact timetable. Asked in Parliament when the 14 Challenger tanks it has agreed to supply will be deployed onto the battlefield, Wallace said it'll be this side of the summer or May. It'll be probably towards Easter time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The call for evidence for the...
Well, obviously, for security reasons, my honourable friend, I can't tell my honourable friend exactly the timings. What I can say is it starts with training on the individual operation of the platforms, then on training on being able to join together with formation units to fight as a formed unit, because that's important, and then from then those tanks will be put in. What I can say is it'll be this side of the summer or May. It'll be probably towards Easter time.
Now, the Kremlin has denied Johnson's claim, that is Boris Johnson's claim, former Prime Minister of the UK, saying that the former British PM was lying when he said President Vladimir Putin had threatened him with a missile strike during a phone call in the run-up to what Moscow calls its special military operation in Ukraine. Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that what Boris Johnson said was not true, or more precisely, a lie, and that there are no threats of missiles. Peskov said Putin had explained to Johnson how, if Ukraine joined the Western NATO alliance, U.S. or NATO missiles placed near Russia's borders will mean any missile could reach Moscow in a matter of minutes, and suggested that there may have been a misunderstanding. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that Russian terror must lose everywhere in Ukraine. Earlier yesterday, Zelensky said Russia had begun its big revenge for Ukraine's resistance to its invasion as Russian forces claimed a series of incremental gains in the country's east.
Russian terror must lose everywhere, in everything on the battlefield, and in every way that there must be no single ruin left in our country, so that we can restore everything and thus prove that freedom is stronger. We are also coordinating our actions to strengthen sanctions against Russia. And I also call on Denmark to join our efforts related to the protection of sports structures and the international Olympic movement from being discredited by the attempt of certain representatives of the sports bureaucracy to allow Russian athletes to participate in international competitions.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, his Croatian counterpart Zoran Milanovic has objected to his country providing military aid to Kiev. A vocal critic of Western policy in Ukraine, Milanovic has said he does not want his country, the EU's newest member state, to face what he's called potentially disastrous consequences over the 11-month-old war in Ukraine. Speaking to reporters during a visit to military barracks in the eastern town of Petrinja, Milanovic says there were many Germans who believe the latest policy moves by Berlin, including sending Leopard tanks to Ukraine, are okay, and others who believe it's utterly suicidal.
To otimanje, dakle, to je dio teritorija je izvučen iz Srbije. Kako se to zove?
We recognize Kosovo. It was annexation. It was grabbing away a part of the territory that was taken out of Serbia. What do you call that? Extraction. It's the same, where someone thinks they're entitled to everything when it suits them, and when the other party does that, it's a crime. In my opinion, it's a question of maturity. It is clear that Crimea will never again be in Ukraine. It is crystal clear. The leading German general said that during the war, and they're saying that now. So it is absolutely clear.
Russian President Zoran Milanovic. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman have held talks by phone on cooperating with the OPEC Plus group of oil-producing countries to maintain oil price stability. According to the Kremlin, the pair held the discussions as ministers from the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and its allies led by Russia, a group known collectively as OPEC Plus, prepared to hold a virtual meeting on Wednesday. Russian oil production has so far shown resilience in the face of Western sanctions imposed after Moscow sends troops into Ukraine in February and price caps introduced by Western countries in December. Now let's talk to Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine magazine Lviv Today, and editor at the Odessa Review, who joins us virtually from Kiev. You're welcome to the program this morning.
Good morning.
What are your initial remarks concerning the statement from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the advancements of the Russians in the east of Donetsk?
Well, we're seeing now a number of advances by the Russians, but on a very small scale. These advances can be measured in terms of meters rather than miles. But nevertheless, it's still significant because the Russian forces have really not advanced at all for around half a year. So what we're looking at now potentially is the beginnings, the first signs of what is expected to be a far larger Russian offensive in the coming weeks ahead. Russia, of course, in September of last year, ordered the first mobilization of the country since World War II in an effort to make up for the catastrophic losses that the Russian military had suffered in Ukraine during the first 6 months of the invasion. That mobilization is now apparently bearing fruit. We have a large number of troops coming into Ukraine from Russia and consolidating Russian positions, and it would appear that they are now preparing with this now enlarged force to begin pushing further and further forward. So Ukraine is now trying to defend its positions in the east and is expecting, frankly, worse times, tougher times. We're expecting to see more intense fighting in East Ukraine and Russian efforts to seize more territory there, to expand the front lines and perhaps to take some more significant gains.
And it's for that exact reason that Ukraine is asking for more support weapon-wise from the allies in the West, especially concerning the tanks and the fighter jets. Let's start with the tanks. Now, we know that the British Parliament just said, as we saw, that there's a timetable of about maybe 3 or 4 months before the tanks can be deployed and for them to get it on the road and working, and there's training involved, there are technical issues involved. Doesn't this give Russia more than fair warning when the war and the preparations for the war and the defense of the invasion of Ukraine is practically fought in media, social media and otherwise, and conventional media? And when we know that this is happening, Russia will be ready for this when it occurs.
Yes, very much so. It's clear that the announcement of the decision to deliver tanks was a landmark in the war. Certainly a major milestone in Western support for Ukraine. Ukraine's been asking for these tanks essentially since the first days of the invasion. Ukraine's been very clear that it desperately needs these tanks. So the decision, particularly the German decision, to allow the delivery of Leopard tanks and also to allow other countries, third-party countries, to deliver their Leopard tanks, which is a restriction imposed by Germany on its arms exports, was very significant. But as you say, it will take a long time. We're talking months here. We're talking a long period of training. There are technical aspects, there are logistical aspects, so we are likely to only see large numbers of modern battle tanks from Ukraine's partners being delivered and appearing on the front lines in spring, perhaps late spring, perhaps towards the end of spring, so rather than March, perhaps May. Of course, that gives Russia time to prepare. That gives Russia time to brace itself and to prepare a strategy. It also allows Russia time to take more territory potentially. So it's damaging, but on the other hand, there's very little that Ukraine can do about that at this stage. The expectation in Kiev is that these weapons are so significant that they will nevertheless be able to swing the balance of the war in Ukraine's favour. They will give Ukraine a very significant offensive capability that the country currently lacks. And according to many experts, the tanks that will be delivered are superior to anything Russia can field at this stage. Now, Russia is not in a position to field a vastly improved tank force. On the contrary, what we've seen in the past months, since the heavy losses Russia incurred at the beginning of the conflict, is that Russia has been resupplying its tank forces with very old, outdated tanks, some of them dating back to the 1960s. So whilst Ukraine is now receiving a new generation of modern tanks that are advanced than anything Russia has or even had at the beginning of the war, Russia is moving in the opposite direction and is actually fielding older and older tank weapons. So the expectation in Ukraine is, yes, it's going to be much slower than people would wish. Yes, it is unfortunate that this has been telegraphed in the media and is something Russia can prepare for, but nevertheless, it should have a significant impact on the war.
What about, Mr. Dickinson, the other types of weapons that Ukraine is asking for? Now the F-16 fighter jets, to which the U.S. president, as you saw, as we've seen around the world, flatly declined and said no when was asked by a reporter on whether the U.S. will be sending F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Poland have said they will, in concert with NATO. France are a bit in the middle, but they also say they don't want an escalation of the war because that's what sending fighter jets will amount to, the same sentiment that Germany shares. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the first thing to point out here would be that the Western alliance, the coalition of countries supporting Ukraine, has consistently said no before it said yes. If we look back to the beginning of the war, there was great debate, even in the weeks and in the months and weeks leading up to the Russian invasion, over whether it was wise or appropriate or escalatory to provide Ukraine with any weapons. And at the time, the debate was largely confined to handheld anti-tank weapons, the kind of things that will be used by a partisan guerrilla opposition during a time of occupation. There was a large and very, very lively debate around that, and many people opposed it at the time. Those weapons were delivered, and they had a very significant impact in the first stages of the war. We've since moved incrementally on from there. Artillery, rocket systems, now we've reached the point of tanks. Very soon after the tank decision was reached, Ukrainians said, and they're very familiar with this process, then immediately again up the stakes and said, well, now we need jets. At this stage, the messages are mixed. As you mentioned, Poland has said, yes, we will, in partnership with our colleagues. President Biden said, to a very specific question, I should say, no. There was not a long explanation of his position. I think it's quite possible that there may be nuances there. France has said we don't rule it out. So I think at this stage, it's certainly not an immediate possibility, but it is on the table. We may see that soon. Now, it's also important, I think, to explore why those jets are so important. Ukraine needs those jets, again, the same as it needs the tanks, essentially, to regain territory. Without air superiority, at least on a local level, it's very difficult to take and hold gains against a deeply entrenched opponent, as Russia now is in the east and south of the country. So they desperately need the jets. And the other factor with the jets is that jets are the best and first line of defense against rocket attacks. Russia has been waging a very extensive air war against Ukraine and bombing, targeting specifically Ukraine's energy infrastructure now for 5 months in a bid to essentially bomb Ukraine into submission, to force the Ukrainian people to exploit winter, essentially weaponizing winter, and to freeze the Ukrainians into surrender. Ukraine has improved air defense systems, but frankly, the best way to take down the kind of missiles that are being used is to put jets in the air and shoot them down. That's another factor that Ukraine is hoping will influence Western decision-making.
Now, Mr. Dickinson, but let's be clear. When you prosecute a war and it goes to the skies, isn't that the escalation to end all escalations? Isn't that the straw that breaks the camel's back? Isn't that why Russia is so adamant as to say that they'll respond in a very voracious and vicious manner if F-16 fighter jets are given to Ukraine? Not to talk of the tanks, which they responded as aggressively as well. And it's interesting what French President Emmanuel Macron said. He said on that issue that it'll be very clear, it should be clear that if they were to support or were to provide such aid to Ukraine, that those jets would not cross over into Russian airspace. Do you think that if we came to that point, that Ukraine does have F-16 fighter jets from its allies, that it would cause an escalation that perhaps will mean a very devastating consequence in the war?
Well, short of using nuclear weapons, it's hard to see where Russia could escalate. Russia is already indiscriminately bombing civilian targets, is already attempting to wipe out Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, has already caused tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. There's very little to suggest that there is something in reserve that Russia could do and has not yet done. The one unpredictable element here would be an attack on the West. Would Russia actually follow through on its very vague but menacing threats to take the war beyond Ukraine to attack NATO? I think currently the consensus is no. Russia is basically failing to advance significantly in Ukraine. It's failed in its goals in Ukraine. The idea of it then turning around and attacking the largest and most powerful military alliance in world history is frankly far-fetched, and I think very few people believe that. So the language of escalation and avoiding escalation, which we often hear from Western capitals, and most recently from President Macron, I think is to a significant degree for domestic consumption, in order for people like Macron and other Western leaders to be able to say to their audience, look, we are supporting Ukraine, That is our policy, but we're being careful because we don't want to be reckless with French lives or German lives or American lives or whichever country is in question. I think that the Russian rhetoric is essentially treated as empty threats, essentially. Russia's red lines have been in place since, again, going back to before the war began. Giving Ukraine anti-tank weapons was a red line. Giving Ukraine artillery was a red line. Giving Ukraine tanks was consistently portrayed by the Kremlin as a red line. Attacking so-called Russian annexed territories in Ukraine was a red line. If we look back to September 2022, President Putin very clearly said, I will go all the way, I will use nuclear weapons if Russian territories are threatened. He then annexed Ukrainian lands, claimed they were Russian. When Ukraine took back those lands, even though Putin had said, I'm not bluffing, he very specifically said, I'm not bluffing. He made a very clear nuclear threat. When the lands were lost and Ukraine took the lands, Putin did nothing, he retreated. So I think there's a sense that Putin is forced to make these threats, and the West is forced to recognize them in the form of talk of non-escalation. But actually, there's a very clear vision in the West that Russia must be defeated.
Then tell us what it's like in Kiev, where you are right now. What's the mood amongst the people and the residents that still remain? Is there optimism? Is there pessimism?
The mood is resilient. I think optimism perhaps would not be the right term. I think people do expect there to be ultimately victory. They do not anticipate that Ukraine will be lost. Having said that, they recognize that very tough times lie ahead. The city of Kiev itself is quite still vibrant. The population is slightly down from pre-war levels, but the number of people that have left, many have returned. And of course, a lot of people from elsewhere in Ukraine have come to Kiev. So the population actually in Kiev is still very large. It's still around 3 million, I believe. And life goes on. You know, so if you were to go out in Kiev on a day like today, you would find businesses working, offices working, restaurants, shops, bars busy. You wouldn't necessarily notice a dramatic difference, but then you do have aspects like there'll be a large number of troops around, there may be air raids, there is a curfew in place, so people have to be home and off the streets by 11 o'clock at night. But we're a long way here from the front lines, of course. The front lines are still hundreds of kilometers away. But in general, I would say the mood, very resilient, very determined. There are frustrations, there are power cuts. There is a deep trauma of this terrible conflict, the terrible losses Ukraine has suffered, but there is still a sense that eventually and ultimately Ukraine will win.
A sentiment that I hope proves true. Now, thank you so much, Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of the Business Ukraine magazine, Lviv Today, and editor of the Odessa Review.
Thank you.
The United States' new ambassador to Russia, Lynn Tracy, has visited the Russian Foreign Ministry in Moscow to present her diplomatic credentials. Tracy was heckled by a crowd of people chanting anti-U.S. slogans as she entered the ministry. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, told Tracy he expected her to follow the principle of not interfering in Russia's internal affairs. The U.S. Embassy said Ambassador Tracy is focused on maintaining dialogue between our capitals at a time of unprecedented tension, protecting the interests of U.S. citizens detained in Russia, and supporting ties between the American and Russian peoples. After the break, investing in drones, Ukraine's Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov says Kyiv is to invest $550 million in drones in 2023. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Croatian President Zoran Milanovic says Crimea, the Black Sea Peninsula annexed by Russia back in 2014, will never again be part of Ukraine. In December, Croatian lawmakers rejected a proposal that the country join a European Union mission in support of the Ukrainian military, reflecting deep divisions between Milanovic and the Croatian Prime Minister Andrej Plenković.
Nije aneksija, to je otimanje, dakle to je dio teritorija je izvučen iz Srbije. Kako se to zove? Ekstrakcija.
We recognize Kosovo. It was annexation. It was grabbing away a part of the territory that was taken out of Serbia. What do you call that? Extraction. It's the same, where someone thinks they're entitled to everything when it suits them, and when the other party does that, it's a crime. In my opinion, it's a question of maturity. It is clear that Crimea will never again be in Ukraine. It is crystal clear. The leading German general said that during the war, and they're saying that now. So it is absolutely clear.
And President Zoran Milanovic, French Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu says France and Australia have agreed to cooperate to manufacture several thousands of 155mm shells to help Ukraine. He announced the aid after he met with his Australian counterpart, Richard Marles, who says the multi-million-dollar project to provide the shells will help ensure Ukraine is able to stay in the conflict and see it concluded on its own terms. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron has said France doesn't exclude sending fighter jets to Ukraine, but he has laid out multiple conditions before such a significant step might be taken. France has sent Ukraine air defense systems, rocket launcher units, cannons, and other military equipment, and has pledged to send armored surveillance and combat vehicles. But it has stopped short of sending battle tanks or heavier weaponry. Asked at a news conference in The Hague if France is considering sending warplanes, Macron said nothing is excluded as long as certain conditions are met. The president said providing such equipment should not lead to an escalation of tensions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met the Danish Prime Minister in the southern city of Mykolaiv yesterday during a rare visit by a foreign leader to a region close to the war front. Video footage posted online by President Zelensky's office showed him greeting his counterpart with a handshake on a snowy street before entering a hospital where they met soldiers wounded in Russia's invasion. The two leaders also visited the Mykolaiv commercial seaport where they saw oil storage tanks hit by Russian enemy missiles and drones and a heating point equipped with water purification and distribution unit under a project implemented with Danish assistance. President Zelensky thanked Fredriksen for the assistance provided by Denmark, whose defense ministry says earlier this month that the country will donate 19 French-made César howitzer artillery systems to Ukraine. Israel Foreign Minister Eli Cohen says the Israeli embassy in Kiev will return to full capacity in the coming weeks, and he will soon be the first minister from the Middle East to visit the Ukrainian capital. The embassy in Kiev has not been fully open since Russia's invasion started nearly a year ago. Cohen spoke at a joint press conference with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is on a visit to Israel. Now let's talk to Dr. Kunle Olawumi, retired Navy Commodore, the head of Department Criminology and Security Studies, Kremlin University, Abeokuta, who joins us virtually from Lagos. It's good to have you on the program this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's begin with the new ambassador to Russia who visited Moscow. Given that Russia has been touted to be the black sheep of the modern world, the aggressor in this conflict, invading a foreign country, and U.S. invariably at odds with Russia. Does it surprise you that Russia welcomed an envoy from the U.S. into Moscow?
Not at all, not at all. The situation as we see it on the ground, I will call it a drama. But there are bigger issues that drive some of the things we see. The United States and Russia, in context, they are just like the PDP and APC government in Nigeria. They're just the same. This is a drama that we are trying to analyze, but basically, the world is governed otherwise. What we see and analyze is not exactly what the strategic plan of these world powers is. We are visiting Moscow. Maybe they are trying to get to the termination phase of this exercise, and they actually govern whatever we see. We just want to refer to it as a drama.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I said that because given that Russia is invariably public enemy #1 concerning this war, and that if she's as bad as the world says she is, in this case, that will she be so friendly as to entertain United States ambassador to Russia? But moving on from there, let's talk about the weapons. I was posing a question to our earlier guests concerning the supply or not of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine from the Allies, whether it will or not be the escalation that worsens any sort of mediation that may be employed in this regard.
Yeah, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. The West, they are still going to supply fighter jets because I listened to Peter, and he has actually analyzed the tactical scenarios. But, you know, as I said, this is a game by the world powers. They are making a lot of money from this. There's no way you want to conduct an operation as it is going on in Donbass, and you want to send tanks. For me, it's a deception. What the Ukrainian needs now, if at all they are very sincere about what is going on, are fighter jets. And I know the French eventually, inevitably, they're going to supply them with the Rafale. I know the Denmark, that the Danish governments are going to supply them with some of their F-16 in the long run, even the Netherlands. And as I said, it's just a game and it's a drama. The objective is absolutely, you know, different from what we are seeing on the ground. There's nothing new in what we are seeing. Before now, if you talk about annexation, it's been going on forever. Look at the United States. Who are the original people in the United States? Look at Israel. Who are the original people in Israel? The Crimea we are talking about belongs to the people are called the Cimmerians. And since then, the Greeks has annexed Crimea, the Romans, the Tatars, the Islamic jihadists, they annexed Crimea before. The Ottoman, the Mongols, even the Nazis, you know, during the Second World War, they have annexed Crimea before. So when I listened to the president saying that, I mean the Belarusian president saying that Crimea will not return back to Ukraine, I think it's a joke. The point is that in the long run, the Crimea region is so strategic to the world. And eventually it's going to be taken from Russia. So you're right that what the Ukrainians now are fighter jets. You know, the lull that happened during the earlier winter has made the Russians to actually gain more ground. They fortified the eastern region further, so that tanks may not be very useful. I mean, before the tanks will arrive, I mean, the artillery pieces, the fighter jets are going to take them out. So what is the use? I'm very surprised that the West are doing what they're doing, because they are the ones that actually lure Ukrainians to this war. If you look at the Lisbon Protocol, I want our audience to study the Lisbon Protocol, followed by the Budapest agreement, you know, that actually deceived the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Kazakhstan. I mean, letting go their nuclear arsenals, you know, with a promise that the Russians, the UK, the US will not use military force or economic means to attack Ukraine. It was an agreement. And the Russians were there, the Americans were there, the P5s were all there. And this agreement was signed. Then when you look at what is happening in Belarus and Kazakhstan and Ukraine today, it was because these countries were deceived into letting go their nuclear arsenal. If those nuclear arsenals were there, I don't think what is happening today will be there. And if they were party to that, to those agreements, then they should do better than they are doing. I feel very bad for Ukrainians, and for them to be withholding the supply of fighter jets to that country to be able to defend his territory, it's a travesty of justice.
Well, you shouldn't feel so bad, Dr. Lamy, because they say it's still on the table for some countries, such as Poland, who say they're on board with it, if only it'll go along with NATO's decisions. And France is not entirely ruled it out, but it has its conditions. But to my next question, which is concerning Russia's position, is there a danger that people are beginning to underestimate Russia? There's certain schools of thought who say that Russia has failed entirely, has expended its military assets, has it concerning its war in Ukraine. That's why it's having such a difficult time. We heard Mr. Dickinson, talking about how obsolete some of their Russian tanks are back, as he said, to 1960s. Are we at a position, or are we at a point where, what is your knowledge on the issue? Has Russia expended its military assets? I know there hasn't been an all-out, for instance, Air Force war against Ukraine. Now, that's from Russia. So is there a danger that people are beginning to take Russia for granted and are underestimating Russia's response if, in the end, the Allies do send those F-16 fighter jets and all the tanks that Ukraine have been promised are indeed deployed?
Yeah, I think it would be wrong to underestimate Russia. I'm not really disposed to what Russia did. But as I said, it has happened before in Kosovo, where the Americans also went there to, take out some tribes. But you see, to underestimate Russia at this time is going to be a mistake. When you are fighting somebody that is a psychopath, like Putin, and that is ill, is a very dangerous opponent. Don't forget that this is a game of gambit. Both sides are playing the game. And the Russians are, I think, master of deception. They are pretending, if you read Sun Tzu, they are pretending to be weak by getting arms from North Korea, to proxies, to China, from Iran, for instance. But that's a game of deception. Recall that the 90% of nuclear arsenal in the world today belongs to both sides, that's the Russians and the Americans. I think in the end, if they keep on underestimating Putin, who I believe is a psychopath and is a very sick man, he's going to use it. He's going to use it. And I think the international community should begin to look for a solution to this conflict. They should not be doing games with the lives, and the health of the globe. They are pushing the boundary. They are pushing Putin to exhaust his arsenals. That's why you can see the help from the West is very slow. If you want to supply fighter jets, you do it now. Time is of essence in war. Or I call this maybe a conflict. Time is of essence. You can't keep on delaying. You delay sending tanks, then at your own time, you are bringing him in. The essence is to draw out the Russians to use their weapons. And when they feel is exhausted, then maybe perhaps NATO will trigger an attack on Russia. But Russia is not a foolish country. They have enough. They don't even use their modern weapons. If you observe, what they did was just to all those weapons that they had, World War I, World War II, that are rotting away in the armory, they just try to use them and give room for storage for new weapons. Russia is a very big power militarily, and NATO trying to play this game with Putin may lead the world into a nuclear disaster.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on the issue, Dr. Kunle Olawumi, retired Navy Commodore. Thank you for your service serving our country, and HOD Criminology and Security Studies, Christian University in Abeokuta. Thank you so much for coming on the program this morning.
Thank you.
Now, Ukraine's military will spend nearly $550 million in drones this year, and 16 supply deals have already been signed with Ukrainian manufacturers. That's according to the country's defense minister. Both Ukrainian and Russian forces have used a wide array of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, commonly known as drones, for attacks and reconnaissance during 11 months of war. Alexei Reznikov said, quote, "In 2023, we are increasing the procurement of UAVs for the armed forces of Ukraine. Ukraine has received significant supplies of drones from its partners, from Turkey's missile-equipped Bayraktar TB2 to the Norwegian-made Black Hornet reconnaissance drone, which weighs less than 33 grams. Kiev is now seeking to boost domestic production to build what officials describe as an army of drones." Finland's Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto says it's maintaining its plan to join NATO at the same time as Nordic neighbor Sweden, despite a potential Turkish block on the latter's bid. Speaking at a news conference in Helsinki, Pekka Haavisto said, quote, "Our strong wish is still to join NATO together with Sweden." His remarks came after the Turkish president signaled on Sunday that Ankara could agree to Finland joining NATO ahead of Sweden amidst growing tensions with Stockholm. And coming up after the break, an Italian artist brings hope to Ukraine's Bucha with uplifting murals. Please join us again. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. We know the world is a global village and there's a domino effect of things nowadays around the world. We'll be speaking with our business correspondent, Laddie Williams, who is with us again this morning to give us an added perspective of the business side of things as far as this invasion goes.
Good morning.
Good morning, Laddie. Let's begin with the IMF upgrade outlook for the global economy this year.
Exactly. So obviously we had the gloomy outlooks from 2022 from the IMF, the World Bank. What they were seeing was a downturn for the global economy, and we all know why. It's because of the Russia-Ukraine war. We've seen what's happening with inflation, globally. But towards the end of 2022, we started to see inflation peaking. In most of these economies. We saw that happen in the Eurozone. We got a month-on-month deceleration even here in Nigeria. So all of these, happening is helping to, give us a better projection from most of these establishments now, because we're seeing that the China reopening, that's already, showing signs that we're going to get some activity, economic activity coming from China, because now they've eased that zero COVID policy. Being locked down for so long, that will definitely impact, the world, one of the world's largest economies and the biggest importers of oil. So we've seen all of that play into the oil market. So now with this reopening, we're seeing inflation easing, gradually, even though, the central bankers are still on edge, because at the end of the day, inflation is still far away from their target. So they're still going to raise rates, and it's a rate raising season, right now, with the Fed actually meeting today. They're starting their meeting tomorrow. We'll have, their hopefully at 25 basis points. That's what the markets are expecting. So we're looking out for, all of that. So the IMF has looked at all of this and seen that, inflation is still going to keep going down because the central bankers are still raising rates. So that's why we're seeing this projection, from the IMF. It's better than the 2.7% that was projected before.
I saw somewhere that the UK had the worst amongst the world powers, the only economy that shrunk.
Yeah, among the G7, and obviously they did compare, it to Russia. Surprisingly, they're saying that the Russian economy is actually even going to do better, you know, than the UK economy. And obviously, we're seeing what's happening in the UK with the strikes, you know, critical infrastructure there. You've seen strikes from the rail unions. We've seen they've called it the year of discontent. We've seen all of that, you know, shape the UK economy, from even changing, you know, prime minister. So all of that, you know, they've looked at it and seen that, well, the UK is actually going through a lot, you know, right now. And they've seen that, you know, Russia is holding up quite well, you know, regardless of the sanctions, even though some analysts say that, you know, the cracks are still there. And this kind of, you will feel the reactions as in the long term, you know, talking about the Russian economy. But that's what they're seeing for 2023 at this point.
What about the Ukraine grain export?
Yeah, so exports
down 30.8%.
Yeah, exports for the 2022-2023, yeah, that's down about 30%, and obviously we know why. We've seen the blockade with the Black Sea that impacted their exports for grains negatively, but the deal, the Black Sea deal, that has helped, but there are also some delays, you know, when it comes to inspecting, you know, some of these vessels. So that's actually impacting, you know, how much exports are going out, you know, from Ukraine at this time. So it's slowing down, you know, the exports, but at the end of the day, we're still getting something out of Ukraine, you know, with this deal, which is a plus. But they need to hasten up the inspections so that we can get more grains out of Ukraine at this time.
That's a lot to take in, and a whole lot more later on Business Morning after the program.
Yeah.
It's good to have you again, Laddie.
Thank you.
Now, the Ukrainian Air Force has warned that it does not have the means to defend itself against Iranian ballistic missiles if obtained by Russia for use in its war in the country. The spokesperson for the Air Force Command said Russia is still willing to receive unmanned aerial vehicles and the other types of missiles, including the Zolfaghar from Iran. Those are ballistic missiles. He says we do not have means to defeat them. As of November, Iran was preparing to send about 1,000 more weapons, including surface short-range ballistic missiles and more attack drones to Russia to use in its war against Ukraine. The Iranian government acknowledged in November it had sent a limited number of drones to Russia in the months before the start of its invasion of Ukraine, but has denied supplying military equipment for use in the war. Now, for the sporting perspective, when it comes to this invasion, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has compared the possibility of Russian athletes competing at the Paris 2024 Olympics with Germany hosting the 1936 Olympics. Last week, Ukraine's sports minister said his country would not rule out boycotting the games if Russian and Belarusian athletes took part. They've been banned in some sports while they're allowed to compete under a neutral flag in others. The International Olympic Committee said on Wednesday that the Olympic Council of Asia had offered Russian and Belarusian athletes the chance to compete in Asia, giving them a qualification pathway for the Paris Olympics. Finally on the program, an urban artist from Italy drew a series of murals containing messages of hope and freedom in towns north of Kyiv associated with some of the worst war atrocities since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 24th. The artist, known as Tivboy, said he undertook the Ukraine Street Art Project, drawing murals on humanitarian aid points and damaged buildings during a week-long visit to Ukraine, which had been organized by a humanitarian organization. Barcelona-based Tivboy says that the murals were his way to pay tribute to the bravery of the Ukrainian people. Locals and art lovers from the capital visited the artwork, which they said were uplifting, but at the same time offered reminders of the ongoing war, the major battles of which are now being fought hundreds of kilometers east of Kyiv. That's it for our special coverage today of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Do have a great day.